And welcome back. We are today going to dive into the concept of creating and designing a user interface or a UI. Now, a user interface, of course, is simply just a screen that somebody interacts with, whether that's on a computer, a tablet, a phone. It's just simply that space that they're going to interact with. Now, that does mean where we are designing for, we do have to consider some things. So in today's lesson, we're going to particularly look at vertical design because smartphones are very prevalent today and many apps and features are very dependent on that vertical ratio. And to get us started here, I wanted to first take a look at this graphic here. Now, of course, this is just showing a couple example phones here, but you can see a couple important things here when we start considering things like vertical design. For example, in each of these phones, you can see there's this natural region here. So this means for people who are holding their phone, this is going to be a natural area where their thumb is going to travel. So in each of these natural zones, that's a natural spot for your thumb to kind of rest. And so that is a great area if you're going to have any kind of element where people need to click or drag or have any kind of thing that's going to interact with them. It's going to be designed here in that zone. In the stretch zones, that is an area where they can still get to it, but it might take them a little bit more reach to get to it. So it's okay to put elements here, but it's not necessarily the golden zone like the natural areas are. Now, of course, especially as you get to larger phones, you'll see these OW regions show up here. So these are regions that are red. These, of course, are areas where the user is not physically able to simply just move their finger there. They would have to physically pick up or use a different appendage in order to reach these zones. So in these red zones, these are areas that are much better to go ahead and instead design elements that are going to be static or unchanging, things that aren't going to require the user necessarily to interact with. But anything we want them to click and drag, remember the golden zone is best, and then the stretch area is still okay, but it's not as ideal. All right, now that we've kind of established a couple ground rules here, let's actually go through and make a very basic user interface. Now, we're not going to go through and do like any programming of one. We're not going to design any functionality. We're simply just approaching this from a design standpoint. So let's go up here to File and New. And today we're actually going to change this up just a little bit. We're going to go slightly larger than what we've done before. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this width here and make this 320 pixels by 480 pixels. So this is a lot larger than what we're necessarily used to working with, but that is perfectly okay. Now, of course, if you notice when I do that, you'll see that the orientation automatically changes here to a vertical orientation. Now, if I click on the vertical one here, you'll see it just switches those numbers around, which means this is going to be how we've kind of been working with most of our pictures, except most of our things have been, relatively the same, 8x8, 16x16, 32x32. So here we're actually going to get into it where we can actually toggle these. So if I wanted to keep these dimensions, but wanted to make this a vertical picture, I could just click that. It's automatically going to switch them. But because we're kind of approaching today's design from, let's say, a phone, we're going to want to make sure it's on a vertical design. Now, the rest of this we can kind of leave as is. I'm not going to change anything there. Let's go ahead and tap Create. And you can see our canvas is a lot larger than what we're used to working with. I'm going to go ahead and use Control-0 here just to zoom in. Now, today it's okay if we have elements that are a little bit larger than what we're used to working with. But what I'm going to do today is I'm first going to kind of segment this up into my different zones. So I'm actually going to go ahead and let's grab our pencil tool here. And I'm just going to go ahead and you notice my pencil tool is really small right now. All right, and that's simply because of where we're at. We're at 1 pixel, and that's perfectly fine. So if I were to draw this pencil tool, you can see I can draw a line in here, and you can see it's segmented that off with 1 pixel. All right, no problem. But I can also, of course, bring that pencil size up a little bit. I'm actually going to change that to black here just real quick. And I can go ahead and draw that across. Now you notice it looks a little bit blurrier here, but if I were to zoom that in and get a lot closer here to my actual pencil tool, you can see we still have those nice hard crisp edges that we're used to seeing, but it's just that when we zoom out here, those edges actually looked a lot softer. And that's one of the advantages now as we move into these larger pictures, that we will have some of this come in here where we won't see that effect really kind of happen anymore. Now, of course, if we look here very carefully, we are meeting the edges, which is very important for us to make sure that those are being met. And I'm going to go ahead and paint off the other zone down here, because remember, these are the areas we don't necessarily want to work with. And I'm just going to go ahead and roughly make an area here that's going to be my ideal zone. And maybe I can bring that down just a little bit here. So this is going to be my ideal zone. All right, and this is simply just to kind of act as a template for me as I'm filling these in. So let's go ahead and use our paint bucket tool. I'm going to go ahead and choose a red region. Let's fill those in. And let's go ahead and do a blue region. And let's go ahead and do a green region. And this is more, again, just for us to have a reference as we start designing our UI elements here. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer. So this is just going to be underneath everything here, again, just for reference as we start populating our user interface. So let's think about common elements of your user interface. You're probably going to have some kind of button, some kind of user interface thing, like there's a profile, text, etc., that you're going to use to interact with. All right, you go ahead and pause the video just for about 15 seconds and think about what are some of those things that are very common in a user interface, whether it's a phone, app, whatever, that you might have present. Now, I'm going to go ahead and have you pause, and when we come back, I'm going to go ahead and build an example user interface that you can follow along with. All right, I hope you had a chance to think about some of those things. And here's a quick list that I came up with of different things that we could think about would be in a user interface. So I thought about things like, okay, we could have things like, for example, a profile picture, a sign out button, a picture album, a music player. And of course, there's usually some kind of legal area where like things like copyright exist. So let's go ahead and take these 5 things and see if we can put them in really quickly. So a profile picture is probably going to be something where it could just exist. It could be the center of the image. But let's, for our intents and purposes, say, hey, that profile picture, it just needs to be present. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use, we can either use our selection tool, so we can go right into our ellipse tool here. I'm going to use my selection tool there and let's do an elliptical tool this time. I'm just going to go ahead and draw that here in this region here. And actually, I want to go ahead and modify that. I have those abilities. I can maybe go ahead and expand that if I want. Let's just say expand it by 1 pixel. Looks great. And I'm going to go ahead and say, I want to fill this in just with a color here. So let's go ahead and use our paint bucket tool. And just for our intents and purposes, we're just going to go ahead and say, what, instead of that being black though, let's just use a color to represent that. Let's use this nice cool blue, looks pretty good. I'm going to fill that in. And what I want to do is maybe put something that goes alongside it, because this is the picture that's going to be represented, but we also maybe want like a username that might go with this. So I'm going to switch to my rectangular selection here, and I'm going to go ahead and just draw a rectangular box underneath that. And let's go ahead and fill that one in. But I'm just going to go ahead and fill that one in with maybe instead of this light blue color here, let's just grab that just for a reference. We're going to go ahead and use a little bit of a different shade of blue, so maybe a little bit darker, just to kind of use it as a reference there. And you can see now, of course, we have that there as it's part of this shape. And if I just click off that deselect, you can see we do have some feathering going on here, all right, with these 2 shapes. So one of the things I have to be careful about is when I start putting these shapes in here is that they are not, of course, overlapping. It looks like this one, actually, I accidentally moved that off the layer 1 there. So I just have to be careful that when I am using these here, that I don't start destroying other elements here. So sometimes that might be a good time to go ahead and make sure that when we make these individual elements, we make them all on their own layer. So I'm going to go ahead and again fill that in with that darker blue. And if I deselect that, you can see how it kind of overlaps. But I maybe want that picture to be over top of the name. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag layer 2 up. And you can see now it's over top. Or if I want it the other way around, I can do that as well, because maybe I want the name to be prominent. And I'm just going to go ahead and use the text tool. This is something we haven't really talked about before, but I'm going to use the text tool. Just go ahead and click on that. And I'm just going to go ahead and click and drag inside this region here that I have. And you notice the text comes up really huge here by default because it's coming to 72 point. I'm going to go ahead and drop that down. Let's just try 12 point. That looks a little bit nicer. use my move tool to move that into place. Now, of course, you'll notice that right now we can't really see that color of that text, so that's not really helpful to us. And it's because it's the same color that we had, so I'm just going to go ahead and this time I'm going to actually make that pretty close to a white there. And you can see here's my text now. And I'm just going to go ahead and click on it, use Control A, and just type user name. All right, so there is our profile. And what I'm going to do is now I'm going to actually take these 3 layers here, since this is all one thing. I'm actually going to add those inside of a group here, just so that way I can keep track of it. And so that is going to be profile. And let's go ahead and really quickly go ahead and add in some of these other things here. I want you to go ahead and try to attempt those on your own. Add a sign in, sign out button. I want you to go ahead and add that right up here to the top. Add a sign out button up here. And then I want you to go ahead and add a album piece right here and a music player right here. So go ahead and add those other 2 elements in here, or 3 elements I should say, because you have the sign out button. And then the legal stuff we're just going to put as text down here. You can put a box around if you want, or if you just want to put it just as text, that is fine too. All right, pause the video. I'm going to come back. Let's see how you did. And welcome back. Hopefully you had a good attempt. I went and created a couple of small things here, very simple. I went and created a couple boxes here with some mild gradients to simulate buttons. I dragged in a picture of my moon to simulate a picture here, and I went ahead and added a triangle here to kind of simulate a play button for music. Now, of course, you notice I have everything organized here into groups, which makes it very handy and very easy to keep track of my different elements. Now, of course, this doesn't look as presentable with this kind of color blob back here. We can just hide that for now, and let's go ahead and just add one more layer here. And this, of course, is just going to be our background, because we need something to actually be the background of this. And I'm just going to go ahead and choose a gradient. Since most of our things are kind of a bluish tone, we could, of course, contrast that using color theory. But let's just go ahead and pick something a little bit nicer here. That looks pretty good. If I do something like this and do that, you can see the issue that we might run into here is we might have some blending with our elements. So this is when things like color theory actually come in really handy, because we can actually use them to make elements and color changes that are going to actually help things stand out, rather than just get lost in the blur here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick one that seems pretty nice for now, just to kind of give a start here. But again, you see with the blues, this kind of gets blended in here. So let's go ahead and pick something maybe more like one of our purples, just to give us a little bit of contrast. Yeah, I'm going to go maybe a little darker here. There we go. That looks a little bit nicer. And again, this is not a final design. We don't necessarily say this is anything to write home about. This is just something quick and easy to kind of demonstrate some of the different purposes that we would need when we look at those. Now, our next lesson, we will again visit user interfaces, but we're going to actually use this with a little bit more finesse to actually make something that's going to be a little bit more presentable.